Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third in a series of virtual professional development sessions sponsored by the Missouri Association of Secondary School Principals. I am Clark Mershon, Executive Director of MOASSP. We are delighted to have back with us Duane Martin and Rachel Meystedt, attorneys for EdCounsel. Good morning, Duane and Rachel.
Thanks, Clark, and good morning, everybody. I have with me this morning not just Rachel Meystedt, who is a member of the EdCounsel team, but we also have with us Madelynn Garrett. So Maddie will be helping us out today. These two colleagues, I'm going to basically do a few slides and then get out of the way while they talk to you. They're actually in a separate location from me, which is always a good idea, I think, but they smile. But we're going to be covering a lot of different topics today, things that are not purely legal in nature, but usually have a legal component, things that tie into what we talked about last time. Last time we talked about general considerations in personnel. This time we're going to talk about really instruction, building operations, and whole child supports. And we really specifically are going to talk about the legal components as they tie into those issues. We know you've been considering those issues in a number of different angles or from a number of different angles as you prepared for reopening, but we want to talk a little bit about the legal perspective on a few of these issues. And then we want to really open it up for Q&A. We want to bank some time at the end and open it up to any questions that you might have regarding legal issues generally. So anything associated with reopening is going to be fair game at that point. So we'd like to just bank some time at the end so that you have the opportunity to ask any questions that you might have. I'm going to go ahead and get us started with the topic of instruction as soon as I can get my PowerPoint up here. The thing that I would say is that we don't really typically think about a lot of legal issues associated with instruction, but with the environment that we're in right now with reopening and all of the uncertainties surrounding what we're about to do, there are a number of legal issues that come up with instruction. And some of these things you usually think of from a different angle than just the legal perspective, but I want to tie in a few legal concepts. And then I'm going to get out of the way and turn it over to Rachel to talk a little bit more about the building operational issues, which have significant legal issues associated with them. So, when we start talking about instruction, one of the first things we have to speak to is the continuity of learning. Sorry about that. You know, it's a number of the challenges that we have. You're going to have some that are associated with connectivity in general, and some of you have experienced that. That may lead to some legal issues for you. Also, computing devices for every student if you're going to do something virtually, and then staff training, resources, and technical support are huge issues. And we're going to get into a number of issues this fall, I think, associated with personnel and making sure that we have instructional personnel that are well trained, have the resources that they need to, and that they have the technical support that they need to as well. And then extra academic support for those who have the most difficulty adjusting to distance learning. I'm talking ELL, I'm talking SPED students. We have legal obligations there. So if we're doing distance learning, we're going to have to be thinking about those legal issues. All right, Rachel. Instruction, when it comes to schedules, what I've seen mostly and talked through with clients mostly kind of have three different possibilities, some sort of in-person, hybrid of virtual and in-person, and then virtual. The legal issues associated with in-person primarily relate to safety issues. We have a lot of them, and I know everybody's kind of familiar with masking, no masking, and some of the facial covering issues that come up, and enforcing some of those rules. What we are finding is that you have a different set of rules based on county health official guidance in a number of different parts of the state. Some areas are, for example, requiring masks, others no mask at all, others are optional. So those safety issues bleed into legal issues because they create the potential for liability. We talked about that a little bit last time. But the safety issues are also associated with the making sure that your buildings are clean, disinfected in the appropriate ways, maybe even getting into some of the air filtration issues that you have in the building. So there are a lot of different safety issues that come up if you're doing in person. The other big legal issue that's associated with in person is managing or trying to manage leave and in a way that's legally appropriate. We've had a ton of personnel issues associated with leave management. And the list is we went over a number of those last time, but that is the primary one that we see. When you're talking hybrid, you still have those safety issues in many ways because you have at least some kids in person. You may be able to accomplish distance learning, or I'm sorry, social distancing or physical distancing a little bit better because you may be in one of those programs where you're actually having only some of your kids attend on any given day. Leave management issues are still an issue. And then on virtual, we get into access more than safety in terms of legal issues presented, and then staffing complications. A number of different things come up when we're trying to do virtual instruction. One of the things when it comes to scheduling that I think is going to lead to some problems is that we've had districts, in particular smaller districts, that haven't planned for the contingencies of what it looks like. What happens if we have to close a building? What if we just close a classroom? What if we close the entire campus? What's that going to look like with respect to impact on instruction otherwise? And how are we going to manage all of that? So those partial school closures are huge. Thank you, Rachel. Assessments, not something that everybody wants to think about when it comes to August, but in our 2020 spring assessment window, it was canceled. We got a waiver, and there were some means of taking care of that in the spring. For 2021, we have no indication that assessments will be waived. So we may very well be responsible for the assessments. And one of the things that may become an issue is what are we doing and what do we plan for district assessments? What do we have in place to take care of those this fall? And are we planning just to go with as we did in the past and with no fallback plans if we have to go virtual, et cetera? So be thinking about that one. And then evaluation of teacher performance. This is one that I'm not sure people have really thought as much about as we'd like, at least from a legal perspective. As we are adjusting to a virtual, either at the outset or as we go through the school year, we've got to be evaluating that instruction. And we've got to be, and our building leaders have to be in a position where they have some flexibility on how they're doing those evaluations and communicating clear rules and expectations to our staff members so that we can evaluate them fairly. One of the things that I would say is that we probably need to have a conversation with our staff up front about here's what we expect the evaluation cycle to look like. However, we've got contingency plans and we may need to make some adjustments. When you do make those adjustments, you're going to need to over communicate your administrative direction, because there's going to be plenty of opportunity for somebody to say, I didn't understand what the expectation was. I didn't understand what the rule was. And so as we direct and redirect through the contingencies, going to have to over communicate with everybody, and preferably in writing. Carefully review the system for evaluation. Okay, what are the indicators? I mean, are the indicators the ones that really are the priority in our current situation? Be thinking about that. How will classroom observations occur? If you're virtual or if you're hybrid, how are you planning to accomplish your classroom observations? And what's that going to look like? And what are we spelling out for our staff members about how those observations are going to occur? Student surveys, similarly, what are we going to do there if we do those? And in the hybrid situations, are we going to evaluate both settings? Are we going to evaluate just the classroom work? Are we going to evaluate what they're doing virtually? All of those things are things that you need to be thinking about. One thing that I would just add as a brief note of caution is that if we are conducting our evaluations virtually, meaning our one-on-ones that we would normally do in person with a staff member, and we're doing those by Zoom or some other virtual teleconference, just bear in mind that there may be a greater propensity for that employee to start to record those kinds of things without you realizing that it's being recorded. So just bear that in mind. That's something that we've had kind of pop up. Feedback is crucial in virtual instruction, in particular since a lot of our staff members are not as well versed in virtual instruction as they are in classroom instruction. So we probably need to be giving a lot of feedback on what's working and what's not. And if you get to the point where you have to make a high stakes decision, make sure you're consulting with legal counsel before you move too far down the tracks, because we're going to need to posture this in a clear way. In a nutshell, what we're going to be talking to you about is providing clear administrative direction and then seeing if they violate that direction. So basically, as you're making adjustments, we're going to be looking for clear written instructions to them and seeing if they follow them. So that's just kind of a top lining of it. All right, Rachel.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit about building operations. This section is just going to focus on now that we're back, or now that we're getting ready to open our doors to students and staff, what are the different things that we need to keep in mind with regard to reentry plans and plans for those safety measures. And then I'm going to pepper in some appropriate legal considerations for you all as we kind of move through this. So the first and foremost guideline with regard to putting together plans for facility access and safety measures is to work closely with your health department and follow those guidelines. And it's not only important just because, as attorneys or as educators, we're not necessarily on the front lines or on the up and up for any sort of medical advice, but these are the places you can go to get that firm guidance on those sorts of things. The other aspect of this that's important is that your board policies regarding communicable disease, both MSBA, NCE, and our EGS clients have communicable disease policies. And most of those, or all of those policies, discuss following guidelines, consulting with the health department, following guidelines from the health department and consulting with them on how to work through different issues, provide safety measures, and then also in responding to staff members who have, staff and students who have communicable diseases. So it's just really important to ensure that you're consulting your policies and following those to mitigate all the risks to the district.
Rachel, can I add something there?
Absolutely.
This is an issue that we've been dealing with a lot this week because the board policies basically say that employees or students with communicable diseases will be managed in a way that's consistent or in accordance with health department guidelines, county health department, and city health officials, as well as DHSS. Others talk about just CDC. And the reason why this is becoming important is that as we have started looking at activities and whether or not activities will be engaged in this fall, we're getting conflicting things from various county officials. And so a lot of people are asking the question, well, what's the risk to the district? And what's the risk to me as a building leader or a superintendent if we make decisions that are not consistent with our county health officials? For example, if a county health official tells you point blank, don't play sports this fall or don't engage in high contact sports like football or soccer, then and you go ahead and do it, the exposure to liability is there. Normally we would have immunity, but the problem is if you're not following your board policy, which in turn says to follow the county health officials, you may be opening up yourself to some level of individual liability, or at least claims might be made. I'm not saying they're necessarily going to be successful, but it's more likely that they'll make claims and they're going to say you didn't follow your board policy, which contemplated you'd follow the health guidance. So I just wanted to interject that because we're getting a lot of questions about that right now, not just district exposure to liability, but also individual liability of our leaders. So thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, Andy. So one of the main things we've all talked about with regard to health department guidelines are PPE, how we're going to be addressing PPE, whether the district is requiring them, whether they're required for staff and encouraged for others, those sorts of things. And so it's, again, important to work with the health department on what exactly your district is going to do and then determining how you're going to put that into place. And so are we providing hand sanitizer for use as needed? Are we requiring its use? And then are we checking temperatures at school other than when a student has visible symptoms or says they don't feel well? Or are we going to do some sort of screening at the door? Those sorts of things are definitely things to work through as you're reopening. And of course, as we're all familiar with, social distancing or physical distancing, we always want to maintain at least 6 feet of distance. And so what are we doing in instances if that can't be accomplished? Are we requiring masks in that instance? Are we taking extra steps to ensure that physical distancing can occur? These are just all considerations that we need to take into account. And these are all pretty much general guidelines that we've seen across the state from local health departments. Yours, of course, in your area may differ from this, but essentially we're limiting group size to the extent possible. So we may not be having, assemblies or big groups. We're probably not going to be having any field trips, that sort of thing. We're also probably going to be limiting non-essential visitors and volunteers. So if we do have class parties within our classrooms, are we going to allow parents to come and volunteer? Are we going to allow parents to come and eat lunch with kiddos? Those sorts of things. And then also, of course, we're all, as within everything else, we're kind of leaning heavily on virtual. And so it's important to think through pursuing virtual activities instead of those assemblies or the field trips and that sort of thing. Another thing that has come up that we've seen from districts is that they're considering facility improvements as a result of COVID-19. And where that can come into play or can be helpful is that some districts are finding they're receiving this CARES Act funding for items that were not in the budget in March 2020, but arose as a result of COVID-19. So that federal money is kind of trickling through a couple different avenues and can be spent on items necessary to further health and health protections, those sorts of things. And so some of these items may not be things that you have in your building, but could be things that you could use that CARES Act money for that would still be around once, hopefully COVID-19 is long gone. So you may spend some money on things that could be used up immediately, but also some things like the automatic bathroom accessories, bottle filling stations for water bottles, those sorts of things that you're still going to have in the future, as opposed to hand sanitizer and things that are used up. So another building operation item are school meals. And so as of right now, it's kind of like with the assessment waivers. Currently, the waivers that have carried over from last school year are the meal pattern requirement waivers. So, we're not really strict with regard to the items that are included in our meals at present. They don't have to be necessarily served in group settings or at specific times. So we can have meals moved to classrooms instead of the cafeteria, or we can have smaller groups eat in the cafeteria at odd times or staggering times, those sorts of things. That waiver is currently in effect. There's also currently in effect a waiver that allows a parent or guardian to pick up meals when you're distance learning and that student doesn't have to be present. And also the offer versus serve waiver is in effect. And so, typically we're required to meet meal pattern requirements again. or, students have to choose to eat a certain number of items before we can count that as a reimbursable meal. And that waiver is still currently in effect. It's possible, depending on how things go, that other waivers will trickle in as the year goes by, but these are just the ones that are currently in effect. Along with school meals for your re-entry plans, we want to think through what types of foods we're offering, since we do have those waivers we just discussed, whether a lot of our meals or our foods are going to be prepackaged, and whether or not we're going to allow students to bring their own lunches or their own snacks, how those might look. Some districts, at the guidance of their health department, of course, have recommended that any containers that these lunches or snacks are brought in are disposable. So we don't necessarily have the zip up Spider-Man lunchbox. We're bringing food in brown paper sacks that can be thrown away at school, those sorts of things. Also, are we requiring hand washing before and after lunch? Are we encouraging it? And then also with regard to school meals, we need to think through or put in a plan in place, contingency plan in place for distribution of meals during closure, if that's something your district is going to be doing. So transportation related issues, there are a lot of things that go into this. And so not only are we looking at it from the aspect of the routes and how we are picking up students and how we're dropping them off, but also the safety measures that will carry over into transportation. And so depending, we need to think through how our routes will be run, how many students will have ride the bus. That could be because of any promotion we're making with regard to having parents pick up or drop off or carpool with students instead of having transportation. If we're limiting transportation to a smaller number of students than we have been in the past in accordance with the law, of course. And so we just need to think through those different things. And also, what safety measures are we taking on the bus? So are we wiping down seats? Are we having students wipe down seats as they get on? Are we taking temperatures before we're on the bus? Those sorts of things. As I mentioned, are we promoting options outside of busing? And so that kind of not only covers students or parents dropping students off at school, but we've gotten a lot of questions lately on transportation to career and technical education. And so typically your district may not allow students to drive themselves to CTE because it's a distance away for whatever reason. And lots of districts are thinking now it may be better to allow students to drive themselves if they would like. And so we have been working through providing parent permission slips for districts in that instance, since this is a deviation and there could be some greater risk involved with the student driving themselves, to ensure, the parents aware of their responsibility for insurance and abiding by, their student needs to abide by rules of the road, those sorts of things. It's good to be on the same page with regard to that and who's responsible for what. Another thing that's come up is staggered arrivals. And so one way, of course, to ensure that we're providing physical distancing is to have lower number of students enter the building at the same time. And one way to do that may be to stagger our bus routes. And so if you do that, that's completely fine. But one thing we need to make sure of is that we're not shortening a special education student's school day as a result of these staggered arrivals. So of course, in a lot of situations, you may have special education routes because special education or transportation is a related service in that student's IEP. And it could be because they're medically fragile, they require more bus aids, accommodations on the bus, those sorts of things. And so it could be easier, of course, to take a busload of students. We're properly physically distancing, but your special education students may need greater distance on the bus and have a smaller number of people on the bus. And so that's all fine. We just need to make sure if we're going the route, dropping all the regular education kids off, and then we go back to pick up students with disabilities, that once they're dropped off, their school day isn't lessened, because if we are shortening a student's school day, because of a related service, we're likely opening ourselves up to some discrimination complaints. And again, we kind of mentioned this a little bit. We're going to make sure we're thinking through transportation safety measures. Lots of health departments have taken looks at these different things or made recommendations related to these items. But how are we socially distancing or physically distancing on the bus? Do we have kids in every other seat? Are we having family members sit together? Those sorts of things. Are we requiring masks or encouraging them? Are we going to have hand sanitizer on the bus? Are we requiring hand sanitizer? And then some districts have been taking temperature checks as a student gets on the bus. Others have just, reminded parents to please screen your student at home before they get on the bus, those sorts of things. And then, of course, as a contingency plan, we need to kind of think through transportation needs during closure. These will likely look a lot like what you did in the spring when this first came about, but it could be more in depth. And so if you have, you may have staff needs that differ from staff members' current positions. So you might have custodians who are helping compile and pass out homework on the bus. The same thing with meals. You have bus drivers and aides running routes to deliver meals, those sorts of things, which might require some cross-training or alternate assignments or alternate, responsibilities, job responsibilities. And so those are just things you think through, who might be best for those, and how you're going to effectuate that. The thing to keep in mind with this is if you do have any staff members with disabilities and you're going to be reassigning them tasks, it may require you to come back to the table with regard to interactive discussion to think through whether there are any accommodations those staff members are going to need based on their new job duties. So just something to keep in mind. So the next few slides kind of work through activities, which I know is probably a really hot topic for our middle school and high school principals right now. These next few slides work through things to keep in mind and also reflect the MSHA guidance on resuming activities. So, of course, as with everything else, MSHA is recommending that if we're practicing in smaller groups. So you might, have typically had your varsity and JV practice together. We're going to separate those now. You may have 6th, 7th, and 8th practice together, but we're going to, move those apart depending on the teams, how they're made up, those sorts of things. And then to the extent possible, we're going to maintain social distancing. So if you have, if you're scrimmaging in some way and you have students who aren't, or athletes who aren't participating, we may have designated spots for them to stand while the others are participating, that sort of thing. So MSHA is asking districts to track body temperature and actually screen participants, coaches, and all these individuals every day before they're allowed to practice. And so we need to, the MSHA is requiring that either we take temperatures at school or at practice, or the individual shows proof that they took their own temperature at home before they came. And so I'm envisioning maybe a picture of a thermometer with some sort of timestamp or some way. But either way, we're looking for, of course, a temperature of 104 or greater. Individuals are required to wear masks until they're screened. And if they're screened and sent home, they need to be cleared by a healthcare provider or after 14 days of quarantine. If there has been an exposure, MSHA is saying that coaches, participants, or the director has to quarantine for 14 days from the date of exposure to COVID-19, regardless of whether they have a negative test. And so, we may be able to do a rapid test at 10 days, but MSHA is still gonna require that we quarantine for 14 days. Another thing that comes with activities is, we have fans and we have individuals, we have parents and students who want to come watch games. And so what are we requiring of observers? Are we requiring masks? Are we somehow delineating different seats that can or can't be sat in? to ensure that there's proper physical distancing. Another thing that could be important is considering whether we're going to live stream games to ensure that, you know, individuals who want to take part and see how, you know, well our sports are going have access to do that, but they're doing that safely at home instead of, you know, coming to school and contracting or bringing things with them. Meystedt has also said we're not going to be congratulating each other after games, no high fives or fist bumps. And then they've also been requiring anyone who's on the sidelines, including players while they're not playing, to wear masks. Concessions is something, if you're going to allow the public in, are we going to also have a concession stand? That's just, you know, typical. That's a fundraiser for your student activities, I'm sure. And so is that something we're going to allow, or are there certain things that we're going to do to ensure that those are safe? So no longer maybe selling nachos and hot dogs, but we do have prepackaged food that can be sold, or are we just not going to allow concessions at all? Those are things to keep in mind. Something that we have kind of worked through over the summer with regard to activities or waivers of liability. And so these are things that can be used. They're good to kind of get everybody on the same page with regard to the requirements of social distancing or any things that you're requiring of your athletes during the games or practices or that sort of thing. We also know that, of course, as Duane mentioned, school districts have official and sovereign immunity. And so we may not necessarily need this waiver, but it could also offer an added layer of protection in the event there is some sort of event and sovereign or official immunity are challenged. And we have these waivers of liability that say that the parent understands the risk of allowing their student to participate, but you know, we're going to move forward with allowing them to participate despite the risk, is essentially what that waiver would say.
Rachel, before you leave that, I do want to talk through that a little bit, because we've had tons of questions about waivers of liability in the activities context.
Yes.
You know, as distinct from, you know, requiring some sort of waiver for a kid to attend school in person. It's quite a bit of difference in terms of requiring a waiver for somebody to attend school that they have a constitutional right to attend versus taking advantage of the privilege of participating in an activity, right?
Exactly, yes.
And so, so we do think that you can use these in the activities context. And then one of the things that we're having one of the things you have to realize about the waiver is it's not just the waiver of liability that's important, it's the notice that you're putting the parent and student on as to the potential dangers, safety risks that are associated with the activity. And so, you know, if you think about it, a lot of the activities that kids participate in may not be as dangerous as some of the others, may not present the same sorts of safety risks. So even some of those traditional activities that maybe we haven't required waivers for in the past, we may want to start doing that. And there's an opportunity for adding language to these waivers, or perhaps in a separate waiver that spells out very specifically some of the risks that are associated with COVID. And that's what I think a lot of districts are starting to really move to, is that maybe there's a separate waiver that puts everybody on notice that there are certain requirements associated with your participation, some of the things you've kind of talked about here perhaps, but then also making it very clear that they're waiving liability if they do opt to participate, with knowledge that there are those safety risks associated with COVID. So we're getting a lot of questions about this right now, because activities are you know, it's kind of one of those things. I would include as much as possible. You can't do too much with respect to the notice and the waiver. Different than what you would do for schools, but meaning attendance at school. But but for activities, I think it's something that's worth the time and effort of doing.
I agree.
That's all you have to say?
I completely agree with my neighbor, 100%. So that is it for building operations. So I'm going to turn it over to Madelynn for whole child supports.
Before we go to Maddie on that, if we can, Rachel,
Sure.
throughout the building operations piece, you were talking about different aspects of health guidance. And, we're getting a lot of questions about, because some of the health officials are, coming up with some interesting approaches to the issues. And I'll just give you a concrete example. Yesterday, we had a particular county official that was offering, who said that we should not have football and soccer this fall, and that it should be bumped to the spring. Okay. But then they offered as an alternative the possibility of, if you go ahead and have those two sports this fall, all participants have to be attending school virtually. They cannot attend in person. And the logic of that was that they will be in a cohort. It'll be, a smaller group that will be exposed in terms of the transmission and that sort of thing. My point is merely this, that you've got some different ideas out there among health officials. What if you're a school district that lies in several different counties? Which county official do you rely upon?
So my answer would be, sorry, it's really loud. Whichever county health official is being the most conservative or the most protective.
So you go with the most restrictive guidance?
I would, yes. Unless, if all of your buildings are in one county, then the most likely option would be to go with the county health department in which your buildings lie. But ultimately, if we're going with the health department official that's the most restrictive, we're going to be providing the most protection to our students. And then, of course, providing the most protection to our students, and then mitigating our risk with regard to any transmission or that sort of thing, because we can point to their guidance as being what we followed.
So if we do deviate from the county health officials' guidance, who makes that decision? Is that a decision that gets made by the principal? Is it a decision that can be made by the superintendent? Is it a decision that gets made by the board? Who do you think is best to weigh in on this and make the determination that we're not going to follow the county health officials' guidance?
So if our board policy says that we are going to follow health department guidance, then
which many of them do, right?
Right, exactly. I think that's going to be a board decision that they're going to have to make, and likely maybe modify policy or enter into a temporary resolution that pertains directly to COVID-19 to make it clear that, we are following whatever we are going to follow, CDC, Department of Health, Meystedt, that sort of thing, and why we've chosen to do that. And I think it's really important to be able to say why. We are adding these extra protections. We, don't believe there's risk because of X, Y, and Z, those sorts of things. But ultimately, I think it's going to be a board decision if our policy says that. We're going to follow those health departments.
Good, thanks for that. Sorry, Maddie, I think she was getting ready to turn it over to you, and I just wanted to get that in there because I think we're getting a lot of questions, and it's very important to me that we express to the principals that that's probably not a decision they want to make. If their board policy says they're going to follow county health official guidance, it would not be prudent really for an individual building leader to kind of make that call without having it run up the flagpole and an official decision made that directs them to not do something that's contemplated by the board policy. So just wanted to make sure.
That makes it a lot easier for principals just to defer that decision to the superintendent, to the board, doesn't it?
It does, and my concern, Clark, frankly, is that if our board policy says we're going to do X, and then our building leader does Y, and even if it appears that there's kind of a nod, wink from somebody else, that's not going to be good enough, because everybody's going to hold that building leader accountable for not doing what the board policy said. So I think that's just absolutely critical. If we can emphasize that to our members, that's probably what we need to be doing. Okay, Maddie, you ready to stop me from rambling on?
Never. Okay, well, I'm here today to talk a little bit about home child supports and some of the equity issues that may come up or may be highlighted whenever we are looking at reopening schools. I'm also going to touch a little bit on social emotional learning and some of the other mental health considerations you want to think about as we have our student population come back to school with maybe some new or different needs than we experienced previous to the COVID-19. So to start out with some of the equity considerations, we've heard throughout this pandemic that we're all in the same storm, but not necessarily the same boat. And as we're well aware, this equally applies to our students. As principals, you all know that your schools are often a safe haven for our disadvantaged students, whether it be they're accessing food services, if they don't have regular stable food in the home, or they may be escaping an unsafe household whenever they're able to attend school. So as we know, disadvantaged students sometimes don't perform as well as the rest of our populations. And so prior to school closure, this may be the case. And then after going potentially several months without access to education and other resources that your all schools offer, the equity gap for these students will become even wider. So as you've been collaborating to come up with plans about reopening, we're sure that you've considered some of these equity issues as you've done that. And as we know, this school year is complicated by trying to address the uncertainty of the pandemic, as well as the needs of all the students as they return. So I'm going to hit on a few topics here. I'm sure you all have thought about these as the start of the school year is upon us. But first I want to talk a little bit about housing. So many families throughout this pandemic may have experienced some economic hardship, which could include losing stable housing. As you look at your enrollment, you may not be able to locate students that were once enrolled, or you may experience new students in your district due to families relocating, either because of jobs or loss of home, or simply they're living with friends or couch surfing. So we want to touch on that. Recall the district's obligations under McKinney-Vento when it comes to homeless students. Just remember that you need to promptly identify these students and provide access to education and related support services. You need to be enrolling these homeless students even if they're unable to produce records that are normally required for enrollment. And remember also too, part of that process is considering the best interest of the student if they should attend your district or the district of origin. And then moving on to the technology piece, which we've touched on a lot so far, considering virtual education or a hybrid situation, whether a student is homeless or if they don't have internet access and the necessary technology, or if they simply live in an area where internet service is not available. You need to take those into consideration as you're setting up your reopening plans, which can include virtual. We all know these can be barriers as we move forward through the school year with the thought of potential closures. Also remember in the context of technology that under the Constitution, all students are entitled to a free public education. And if there are inequities in students not having internet access, if you're fully virtual or in a hybrid setting, claims can be made that free public education is not being provided. Also think about groups students in protected groups or protected classes that maybe when you set up a plan, you didn't intend for that group to be disadvantaged, but keep in mind discrimination claims could be made if these disadvantaged students also fall into a protected class, such as race, color, nationality, disability, as you're thinking through the technology aspect when going to virtual. Another thing to keep in mind is that there are several advocacy groups that's often look for cases to support their cause. And although these groups can benefit students, it's very likely that they'll be taking a closer look at districts and see how they are working through these issues as the school year starts. So keep that in mind too as you're making plans or going back and amending any plans. Also touch a little bit on student with disabilities, and Rachel may jump in here as well, but so first talking about students that you know have disabilities. So in the spring when school closures happened, there really wasn't enough time to pull teams together and make decisions and fully prepare to educate students with IEPs or 504 plans. And depending on what type of instruction took place in the spring for the general student population, students with disabilities may have received some instruction, they could have received no instruction. So when these students come back in the fall, they'll of course be experiencing regression, probably much like the regular student population, and they may be more apt to have experienced regression if they were also supposed to receive extended school year services that are offered in the summer. So when students with disabilities come back, you kind of have to go back to the drawing board, see what data information you have. You're going to look at parental input, determine if assessments are needed and what new needs a student may have, so that we are providing the student the faith that they need as they are in that moment. Also, if there were behavioral goals involved with a student with disability, you may need to go back and look at prior goals so that you can help build the student back up to where they were. If there are behavior goals, you may look at adjusting behavioral plans and adjust those as needed. A lot of times routine and interaction outside the home is important to students with behavioral goals so that they can have that experience and progress.
One thing I would say with that is that we typically, know that when we have a summer break or we have Christmas break or fall break or something, there's a little bit of a period where the student needs to kind of readjust to the routine that they may not have at home, or the supports and services that they may not have one-on-one when they are away from school. And so it's very likely, I'm sure you're gearing up for this, but it's very likely you're going to experience those same things with your students with behavioral issues, or even students who may not typically have had behaviors that needed to be addressed, but they may now need that. And so there may be a period of time where we're kind of waiting and we're taking data and adjusting to see whether we need to evaluate, reevaluate, do another functional behavioral assessment, those sorts of things. And so it's good to ensure that we're kind of taking the time to see what is something we need to address and something that just needs adjustment. But during that time, we recommend taking data to ensure that we are firmly documenting why we didn't just jump to assessments or evaluations, that sort of thing, to show that, we're kind of giving it time and working through, different behavioral supports, tiered interventions before we get to that point.
Thank you, Rachel. Another thing to consider when students with disabilities return is that the student may now have a new or different disability or new needs that have come about since the spring. And like I said before, the team needs to look at the student as they are now to make sure that FAPE is being provided or FAPE hasn't changed. And the new IEP or BIP or goals or anything like that needs to address those new needs. Now to talk a little bit about students with disabilities that you're not aware of, there could be students over this time period from school closure that could have experienced traumas or new stresses, or maybe they had lack of access to counseling or other services that they were receiving outside of the school setting previously that they did not receive during this pandemic. So it's good to be aware that the obligations under IDEA have not changed during this time period. Districts are still required to identify and locate disabled students and provide FAPE in a least restrictive environment. Of course, we can't discriminate. We have to be providing procedural safeguards to parents and provide equal opportunity to participate in non-academic and extracurricular activities. We realize that identifying and locating disabled students may change a little bit. If you're fully virtual, you need to make sure that that you're still able to carry out those obligations, although education is being provided in a different way. We know educators have a lot on their plate already, but it's a good idea to have your teachers and staff members maybe do individual check-ins with students and parents to find out basically how virtual is going, but also to answer any questions and see if there are potentially any new issues that may need to be addressed, including any potential new disabilities that may have come about. So moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit about social-emotional learning. So strong social-emotional learning needs to be in place as it provides for better academic performance. As you know, this type of learning promotes student self-awareness, self-management, social awareness. It helps develop relationships and develop skills so that students have strong decision-making skills, as well as improve their attitudes and beliefs about themselves, others, their school, their community. These students may have been through a lot, like we've said, experienced traumas or stress over this period, which can lead to changes in their behavior and relationships. And individuals react when they reach a point of not being able to tolerate the stress or the trauma. And some of these reactions can include acting out or shutting down. And we all know that the ability to learn is not just dependent on instruction, but it's also dependent on having positive relationships, having a positive school environment, and positive communications with those around them. We know if a student is distracted while in the academic setting, you can provide the best teachers and the best instruction, but their ability to learn and progress may be inhibited because of those distractions. And in the school setting, when you start seeing behaviors, when you first start taking steps to try to address them, you may want to focus more on what happened to this student as opposed to what is wrong with this student. So you can kind of look at the background of what caused it, and then it may be that the social emotional learning that you can weave into curriculum and that sort of thing that could help address some of these issues and support these students so that they can succeed. Moving on to some of the mental health supports. Again, kind of going back to talking about new needs of student population. As we've discussed in depth, students have experienced trauma and stress over this time period, most likely. It could be unsafe households, it could be a death due to COVID, it could be separation from family members that they were regularly with. And because trauma is individualized and based on the perception of the individual, we may see things that we don't necessarily consider trauma, but to that student it may have been. For example, if you haven't seen grandma for a few months and you've heard about COVID and you're fearing that it may affect her or she may pass from it, when you compare that to someone losing a loved one because of COVID, or simply losing a loved one over this time period and not having interaction with your family members for supports and that sort of thing, the former may seem as not as big a trauma, but in that student's eyes it may be. So we need to keep that in mind, that traumas are individual, and so while we may consider it not as big of a deal as other things that people experience in life, it's still traumatic for that student, and then of course will affect their ability to learn and progress in the academic setting. It would be wise to have your counselors regularly available for students, whether you're an in-person education setting or a hybrid or virtual. Counselors could start scheduling regular check-ins with students and parents beyond what the teachers are already doing. It may be also a good idea to have counselors meet with the teachers and ask them what they're seeing in the student population or a specific student, and what changes they're seeing, and how the counselor may be able to support the students and the parents and the teacher as they move forward, addressing some of these traumas and stress students may have been through.
Maddie, I've got a question for you. I mean, obviously what you've talked about would include a lot of best practices, but where's our legal obligation triggered when we have a student that, maybe has experienced trauma, or that they're showing some signs of some mental health issues? Where does our legal obligation kick in?
Right, so depending on the specifics of each student, if it seems as though the trauma or stress is child abuse or potentially child neglect, of course, as mandated reporters, we're required to report that to the hotline. And also, if these signs may also lead to determining if the student has a disability. So that goes back to child find, and that you have to provide faith to students with disabilities.
Okay, so in other words, if we see something that looks like it may be a disability, mental health impairment, for example, that substantially limits a major life activity, not necessarily aimed at education, but major life activity, then that's going to trigger a requirement for us to identify?
Correct.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Well, I think that was the last slide on whole child supports.
All right, Doug, Clark, we had indicated we would open it up for questions. We're happy to take any questions that anybody might have. Like I said, it doesn't have to be limited to what we talked about today, but just any legal issues that are on folks' minds surrounding reopening at this point.
Sure. Just a couple of comments and maybe a question or two from my seat. As attorneys, are you finding that you're working harder now than you've ever worked before, trying to figure all of this out?
I think that's very true. Part of the issue is that it's twofold. One is that all of our leaders are faced with uncertainties, and the ground rules just aren't established. And so they're going through a completely different cycle that requires them to examine things a little bit differently than what they ever have in the past. And they're just not clear on their legal obligations. And so that's led to a lot of questions. The second part of that is that we don't necessarily have access to the answers because the rules haven't been established whatsoever. And so we're having to kind of sort through this. And so when we look at stuff, we're looking at it from a risk management point of view and a compliance point of view. The compliance pieces are a little bit difficult because they contemplated a situation that's completely different than what we're in right now. So we have to kind of make adjustments there. And then the risk management pieces is we really have to kind of look at the individual facts and try to figure it out as we go along. Some of these things just haven't been dealt with before. So yes, we're staying very busy.
Principals are too. Principals are working harder now than ever before. Concerned if they haven't had a break, they haven't had a break all summer. especially as graduations that have been late and they've been on point the entire summer. Now we're starting school back. So we really
You know,
need to support our folks in the building, and superintendent's the same way. So it's really a tough situation that we are all in.
it is, and you know, one of the things that I'm seeing, Clark, is that that is of a substantial concern to me is that what I would call decision fatigue. Um, you know, our leaders just haven't had a break this summer, and they rolled into this situation, you know, basically in March, and they haven't had really much of a reprieve since then. And so they've had to make decision after decision after decision, and we're getting to reopening, and you can just see it on their faces and in the conversations with them. They are having a real hard time because they know every decision they make is going to cause them to make 5 more, and it's going to impact them, and it's going to ripple from there. And so it is tough right now. I think everybody's just looking forward to getting off to a start, and then once they turn that corner, kind of see what comes and deal with come what may.
All right, and just thought we'd open it up to those on the call if they had any additional questions.
I don't know that I have any questions, but I do want to thank you for validating the whole decision fatigue thing and the whole thing that we're in. I know I sit in a place where I'm trying to open up a seated school, and I am the sole responsible one for setting up my virtual program. So I'm definitely feeling that decision fatigue with everything that's going on. And it was really hard for a faculty meeting with teachers, because everything you covered last week is everything that they want to know. And we have to accept that, you know, we just have to understand that we don't have all the answers right now. And that's hard for people to hear, that we don't have maybe some of those answers, that we're relying on the health department, that, you know, that they're going through with all of their emotions. And I think we just have to be cognizant of that and do the best that we can do. But I thank you for these sessions because they have been wonderful. Clark,
Wonderful. Okay.
You know, Monica, I really do appreciate your comments. And one of the things that you said that is, you know, I've given a lot of thought to is it, you know, as we come back into the school year, every year, you know, we have folks on our staff that really kind of crave structure and look for that sort of stability in some ways. And this year we can't really offer it to them. And that's hard. For them to accept, and even though they know the overall circumstances, they still look to us for that structure and that, you know, those kind of those pieces of stability. And so, you know, it's very, very difficult to face those staff members, I'm sure, and you know, say, well, we're going to have to be flexible because, you know, we're not really sure how this is going to go. That's got to be one of the toughest things, I think, right now.
Yeah, how they're going to maneuver through all of this. But I think the big thing for us is, as an association, that we are going to be here. We're not going to go dark for them. We're going to be here 24/7. And we really appreciate EdCounsel and Duane and Rachel and Maddie for providing this opportunity. You know, if you could give our principals one piece of advice, Duane, you can start, and then Rachel and Maddie, if you could just give one piece of advice, what would it be?
Well, you know, one of the things that, you know, from a legal perspective, not from a leadership perspective, Clark, but just from a legal perspective, which is what I think you're asking of me, is that, you know, we kind of emphasized it a couple times here, but there are going to be a lot of temptations to deviate from what is on the books for board policy. We may not know about what's there in terms of the intricacies. We may not have our superiors that are well-versed in it. But what I would say you got to do is protect yourself by following that board policy, because in many ways you're going to have immunity from legal claims as long as you do that very thing. And as we move into unknown territories, the temptation is to kind of make good decisions as we go, but not realizing that we have rules on the books that we're expected to follow. And that if we step outside the umbrella of that protection of the board policies and the rules that we have on the books, then it comes down to the individual exposure. And that's, if I could give our building leaders one piece of advice, it would be avoid getting yourself in that situation. And if you do deviate from what's on the books, make sure you document why, and make sure that you're collaborating with the chain of command to make sure that they're in on that decision as well, just because you need that protection at this point.
So that piece of advice is really important because that was exactly what was running through my mind.
You can't do that. That's
Yeah, stole it. So from a leadership perspective, what I've heard a lot from clients that I've spoken with is how much support they've been getting from colleagues. And so these associations, like, Missouri Association of Secondary School Principals, and other school districts in the county and that sort of thing, it's been hard, especially even for us, not getting out to see clients and not getting to see people and have the conversations and the collaboration that we're used to, especially in the education world. And so figuring out a way to keep in touch with those people, run things by them, and even having somebody just to vent to is really helpful right now.
Yeah, and my advice kind of plays off both what Duane and Rachel said, but one thing that I see sometimes from a legal perspective is when disputes or disagreements come about, which can lead to personnel issues or things of that nature, is communication, I think, is really important. Kind of go back to what Duane said, collaboration with everyone to come together and kind of make a decision that everyone understands why. Because I think sometimes staff don't understand why certain decisions are being made or the rationale behind them, and then they kind of, what I call, fill in the gaps to decide why a decision was made or why something different for me than someone else. So I think it's really important to document why you're making the decisions, but also make sure you have open communication with your staff so that they understand the rationale and your intention behind it.
Excellent advice, Maddie, Rachel, and Duane. Thank you so much. Our time is coming to a close once again. On behalf of MOSSP, we appreciate your support of our principals across this great state of ours. A reminder that our virtual event is tomorrow. We have another one tomorrow, Thursday, on time. Terry will be speaking about when equity and compliance intersect. So we're looking forward to hearing from Terry tomorrow. Another timely topic as we begin the school year, and we hope you can join us. And with that, once again, thank you so much to EdCounsel, and we will see you tomorrow. Take care. Thank you.